Welcome back to the Odyssey Academy, and today in Lesson 7, we're going to talk about how to write a skit in general. How do you write a comedy skit? How do you write a performance skit? And it turns out there are approaches that you can use to write a skit to make the task a lot less daunting. So today's agenda, we'll talk about what a skit actually is in OM. We'll talk about this idea of 5-point scene structure, which is a useful tool that we can use to write scenes for Odyssey of the Mind, comedy scenes, short plays. You see it all over. Once you learn it, you'll see that it's used all over the world in all types of writing. We'll look at types of comedy scenes and jokes that you can use. We'll talk about proper formatting for writing skits and scenes. It turns out there's a way that you write scenes. And then finally, we'll look at the skit through the lens of point allocation in Odyssey of the Mind. So let's just start out with, what is a skit? When we talk about you have 8 minutes to perform your skit, what does that mean? Well, if you've ever seen Saturday Night Live, those performances, those little scenes that they do for like 5-7 minutes, that's a skit, right? So you've seen it before if you've seen Saturday Night Live or any other variety show. If you used to watch old Carol Burnett episodes, they're on repeat all the time. Those were skits. Those are comedy skits. And so in Odyssey of the Mind, your skit is what you perform in your 8 minutes. It's a short performance where you're presenting your solution, and it's a requirement in Odyssey of the Mind that these skits can't be any more than 8 minutes. If you go over the time in problems 3 and problem 5, you get a time penalty. In problems 1, 2, and 4, you just get stopped because all the elements have to be scored in that 8-minute time period. So 8 minutes, it turns out, is not a long time. So don't be worried if you've never written a skit or a play before. Writing an 8-minute skit happens pretty quickly, right? You'll fill up that time, no problem. Again, your skit also includes the elements of your long-term solution. Essentially, think of this as the vehicle through which your solution is delivered. In those 8 minutes, you need to include all the things that your long-term problem asks for in order for the judges to see them and score them. You'll perform your skit in front of an audience, right? So if you're doing an in-person competition, there will be an audience in the room watching you. And of course, the judges will be there as well watching you perform your skit, which I have here. They'll watch and score your solution. And then note that your skit is also integrated with, if you're doing problem 1, your vehicle, problem 2, your technical device, and problem 4, your structure. So it's not like if you're in problem 1 doing vehicle, that your vehicle just kind of like does its own thing and then like there's just also a skit. There's some integration involved between the two of those things usually, right? So your vehicle is a part of the story that you're telling. In structure, the structure and the testing is part of the story that you're telling in your skit. So even though you're doing those technical problems, 1, 2, or 4, you also have to write a skit, and it's expected you're giving some thought to this performance as well. All right, so what is 5-point scene structure? Well, it's one tool of many possible tools you can use to write a skit. The big idea here in 5-point scene structure is that stories tend to follow a pattern of some kind, right? Whether it's William Shakespeare and the plays that he wrote, or Disney movies like The Little Mermaid or Moana that you've seen, all of these, whether you realize it, actually have a formula to them, right? There are some YouTube videos that have gone around showing the Pixar formula, right? The story approach that they take to creating a really rich and compelling a story for Toy Story or Ratatouille or any of these other films that they've created. There's a formula behind the scenes. Now, you don't think about it because when you go to the movies, you're watching the movie for the sake of being entertained. But I promise you, the people that create those movies, the writers, the producers, the directors, all those folks working on it, have a very clear structure in mind of what the story will look like and what it needs to do, right? That's just the way that stories have gone for a long, long time. Now, the reason we like this structure in storytelling as an audience, but also as creators, is that the familiarity of that formula, it makes it easier to understand the story, right? So before our ancestors would write things down, they would often tell stories and sing songs to pass down information from generation to generation. The reason for that is that it was easier, right? It was easier to do if there was structure, some familiar structure to telling the story or to singing the song, which it turns out songs also have structure, right? Musicians in the audience, you understand what I'm talking about. Now, this does not mean that because you're following a formula that you can't be creative. If anything, by now, we've learned that limitations actually enhance our creativity, right? So again, when we think about the formula of 5-point scene structure, it's not meant to impose limitations to make you less creative. It's actually encouraging to make you more creative. It doesn't mean you can't deviate, right? So 5-point scene structure is one approach, but people deviate from it all the time. There are other approaches as well. Even if you're trained in comedy writing, like I've been, you learn 5-point scene structure, and then you learn how to break the rules, right? You learn how to deviate from those rules. But just know that 5-point scene structure is a pretty universal tool when it comes to writing performances. Again, as I said, it's a useful tool to help you organize your scene. So kind of keep it in your mind like that. That's a useful tool to have, and it'll serve you pretty well. And the last thing, as I alluded to, you'll see this all over the place, right? You'll see that it's used in movies, in books, all kinds of things. When you start watching TV, when you go back to watch movies you've already seen, you'll see this sort of 5-point scene structure all the time. You can't help but look away. It's sort of like going to a magic show after you've learned how to do a magic trick, how a magician's done his or her magic trick. And it's not that you don't appreciate it, you just appreciate it on a different level. So just be aware that 5-point scene structure is all around you. Okay, so let's take you through an example of what 5-point scene structure looks like. So step one is what we call the premise. So right away at the opening of the scene, we want to establish a couple of things off the bat. Who we are, who are the characters, what's happening here, who are these people? Two, what are they doing, right? Are they engaged in some activity? Are they arguing? Are they having a conversation? Like, what are they doing? And three, where are they, right? What's the setting? Are they in Paris, France? Are they on the moon? Are they underwater? Who knows, right? But the sooner you can convey this to your audience, then the sooner the audience is wrapped into whatever it is you're presenting, right? So step one is the premise. We want to establish the premise as soon as possible in 5-point scenic structure, right? Right away, who are we, what are we doing, and where are we, right? That's step one. Step two is what we call the first turning point. In other approaches, we call this the inciting incident or inciting episode. Something is different about today, right? So we've established who we are, where we are, what's going on up front, and then suddenly something happens. Something is different about today. So a lot of times this can be a shift in activity. Maybe we were sleeping and now suddenly we're jolted awake. A relationship, maybe we are friendly at the premise at the beginning of the scene, and then somebody says something offensive and now suddenly we are enemies, right? Objective, maybe at the very beginning of the scene, we are just watching the news, but then there's some story about how there is a treasure that's hidden outside, and if you find it, you get to win $1 million. Suddenly we have an objective. We're no longer being lazy at home. We're gonna go out and be treasure hunters, right? Maybe there's a change in status. So perhaps at the beginning of the premise, we are low people that are just kind of walking through a museum and enjoying the artwork, but then suddenly there's the bells go off, there's an alarm, a painting has been stolen, and the security people have been locked behind a bar, they can't get through. So suddenly we've become now very important. We have to go stop this crime from happening, right? Or maybe there's a shift in emotion, right? So a shift in emotion would be maybe beginning the premise, the characters are super sad, maybe something sad has happened, and then they decide, you know what, let's go to the candy store. So suddenly we're very happy and we're excited about going to the candy shop, and we're anxious, we're eager, we're looking forward to it, right? So our emotions have shifted. So the first turning point is that something different has happened. Something is new about today, something different is taking place, and oftentimes it has to do with one of those 5 categories: a change in activity, a change in relationship, a change in objective, a change in status, or a change in emotion. Cool. So once that inciting incident has happened, once that first turning point has taken place, we move on to step 3. So step 3, we refer to as heightening. Heightening is what it sounds like. Something small happens, then something a bit bigger happens, and then something really big happens, like almost outrageous to the point of absurdity, right, at that point. So what's really happening is the stakes get higher. What are the stakes? The stakes are the wants of the characters, right? So let's go back to our example from a minute ago where we talked about the art scene at the museum. So let's say that the stakes are, if the painting gets out, then I don't know, the museum loses some money. But then let's say that if the painting gets out and gets copied, then it's uncontrollable because now there's going to be copies of the painting all around the world. And then step 3 is, let's say that if there are copies all around the world, that then no one ever comes to this museum again, the museum is going to go completely bankrupt, right? So we started very small, right? So fewer attendance, whatever, copies around the world, and then the museum going bankrupt. So we're starting small and then making something bigger happen. So that's one way of thinking about heightening the stakes of the situation. Another way of thinking about heightening is just taking the same activity and building it until it's like completely outrageous. So say, for example, you're at a library, right? So there's a scene taking place in a library. You're trying to get somebody's attention across the room, but you have to be quiet because it's a library. So in the smallest example, so the first beat 1 is what we call it. In beat 1, maybe we'd be like, psst, hey, peace, like whispering, right? So then a second higher heightened beat would be trying to figure out another bigger way to get their attention, which is no longer whispering. So maybe we make like a little paper launcher where we throw some paper at them. Right now we're throwing paper, so it's a bit more exaggerated. And then the third beat, if we heighten that even more, a different way to get their attention would be maybe to build a sign in neon that's behind us that flashes like super bright letters like, hey, you, right? So again, we started small with whispering. We got a little bit bigger with throwing paper. And then we got even bigger by building this outrageous neon sign that's flashing, hey, you, in big, big blinking lights. That's the idea of heightening, right? We're just getting bigger and more outrageous as our scene progresses. And usually when we do this, it tends to be really funny, right? That's why like almost that neon sign feels like a cartoonish thing you'd see on Looney Tunes or like a Disney cartoon, because it's just so outrageous that somebody would do that. But again, we started small, we got bigger, and then we got really outrageous. In fact, if you go back and watch some of those like Pluto and Chip and Dale scenes from Disney, usually when Chip and Dale were annoying Pluto, he would start small, or they would start small with their annoyance, and then get a little bit more obnoxious, and they get really obnoxious. And then of course, as a child, we would laugh because that's how heightening works, right? So heightening is getting a little bit bigger until finally you get to that third point where you're just completely outrageous at this point. Brings us to step number 4, which is our second turning point, right? So our first turning point was what was different about today. Our second turning point is usually some sort of resolution. How do we deal with whatever's happened in our scene? And usually it relates to our first turning point, right? So if we go back to our example, so say for, at the museum where you were just a guest looking at the artwork and now suddenly you find yourself as a security guard, and we talked about the heightening of what happens if this painting gets away. The second turning point, if it's about resolution of the first turning point, it would have to be some sort of resolution about getting that painting back, right? Restoring that painting to its safe place. So that would be the idea of a second turning point. Now, what that looks like, maybe we apprehend the person that stole it. Maybe we join. Maybe we become a criminal ourselves, like Carmen Sandiego style. The second turning point usually relates to the first turning point and provides some sort of resolution, which leads to step 5, which is called the out. And the out is how we end the scene. Now, historically, there tend to be, or traditionally, there tend to be 2 types of ways we end a scene. One way to do it is the world has already changed, right? Everything is different now, or the world stays the same, right? Those are kind of our 2 options that here we go again. So an example of that in the context of our museum caper, if the world is forever changed, so let's say we rescued the painting, we arrested the criminals, and we got the painting back on the wall, but we made sure that there's like now like 10 levels of security around it. So we have changed the world forever. The painting's back, it's safe and secure, and it will never be stolen again, right? The world is forever changed. If we take a different approach for the out, where, here we go again, maybe we get the painting back, but when we're hanging it back on the wall, we notice that the statue that was there prior to the painting being stolen is now missing, because guess what? It got stolen too. Oh boy, here we go again, right? So again, there are any number of outs. These are the 2 traditional ones we tend to see the most often of the world is forever changed, or, well, here we go again. Either one can be comedy evoking, so that's good. But that's it. That's 5-point scene structure, right? Set up the premise, the who, what, where, what's going on. Then something happens that is different about today. Your first turning point, you heighten, so you build the energy as you go through, like something small, something middle, something really outrageous. Then that leads to the second turning point, the resolution of whatever was introduced in the first turning point. And then you have the out. Either the world is forever changed, or here we go again, right? That's the idea. Again, you can deviate from the structure, but you'll see it all the time. So give you a quick example. This is Beauty and the Beast, of course, the Disney film. If we apply 5-point scene structure to this Disney film, you can do it to just about any Disney film, you'll see just how 5-point scene structure can work, even for a full-length animated movie. So remember, step 1 is the premise, the who, the what, and the where. And Disney movies like to do this through an opening song, right? So you remember, at the very beginning of Beauty and the Beast, there's a song that's like, there goes the baker with his tray like always, the same old bread and roast to sell every morning just the same, since the morning that we came to this poor provincial town. Good morning, Belle. And she said, good morning, monsieur. So point of the story, beside the fact that I remembered all those words, is that song, if you listen to what they're saying, they're talking about where they are. They're in rural France. They're talking about what they're doing, right? They're townspeople in this village. And specifically, they're talking about Belle and how bored she is, right? She's just bored with this provincial life, and she wants more exciting adventure like she sees in her storybooks. Little does she realize she's about to get that exciting adventure. So the premise in Beauty and the Beast is the song Belle. It's setting up who the characters are, where we are, and what they're doing, right? Like that's the idea. So the first turning point, what happens that's different about this world? Well, her father gets kidnapped, right? He gets kidnapped by the Beast, and Belle takes his place, right? So the kidnapping is essentially the first turning point, because that's going to change everything about what's happening in this world. Otherwise, they'd just be living in the little cottage, everything would be fine, right? So the kidnapping is the inciting episode. It's the thing that takes place that changes the world that we live in, changes the premise. So what is heightening in Beauty and the Beast? Well, think about the relationship, right, between Belle and the Beast. At first, they hate each other. He kidnapped her. Not great. Then as time goes on, they grow to like each other, right? They become friends. And at the very end, they love each other, right? So it goes from this relationship of anger and enemies to sort of getting along to like, I actually love this person, right? So that's the heightening in Beauty and the Beast. Now, our second turning point, step 4, usually relates to our first turning point. So if her father was kidnapped, and then Belle, of course, is taking his place, so she's kidnapped, what then would be the related turning point that resolves that situation? Think about it. The villagers come and try to rescue them from being kidnapped, right? Led by the very vain, narcissistic Gaston, right? So if the first turning point is them getting kidnapped, the second turning point that relates and resolves that first turning point is the villagers, or are the villagers and Gaston coming back to rescue them from being kidnapped, right? So it's led, the story is heightened to this point, and it's led to these villagers and Gaston coming back to rescue them. Of course, we know what happens. Gaston falls down. The Beast is transformed. So how does the movie end? Well, the out. Remember, there are 2 types of outs in this in 5-point scene structure. 1 is the world is forever changed, and 2 is here we go again, history is repeating itself. In this case, the world is forever changed, right? Because now, because they have true love, the curse is broken. So literally we see the world changing because the Beast transforms back into a human. All the characters, Lumiere, Cogsworth, all the little trinkets around the house, transform from being objects back into humans. So the world is forever changed, the curse is broken, right? So that's the idea. Now, that was one example from the classic story of Beauty and the Beast. I implore you, go watch a Disney movie, go watch a Pixar movie, go watch any movie, go read Shakespeare, and you will see 5-point scene structure over and over and over again, right? It doesn't mean you have to use it for your long-term solution. I'm presenting this to you as a tool that you can use if you want, but now you realize that writing a skit isn't so hard. There's a formula to it, right? And the more you do it, the more you perfect that formula, the better you'll get at writing skits. Okay. So in addition to 5-point scenic structure, it turns out there are also types of skits that exist. So if you were to study at Second City, which was a partner for Odyssey Academy for a long time, or if you were to, I don't know, take a comedy class online or even at school sometime, you'll probably learn the different types of comedy scenes that exist. And what's cool about this is you see these types of comedy scenes all the time. On TV shows, in movies. So here I'll present you sort of the way we think about it when we write comedy, but you'll see it executed in any variety of media. So we'll start with the fish out of water theme. So a fish out of water scene is where you have a person who's taken from one context and put into a completely foreign context, and comedy ensues, right? So the classic example of a fish out of water story is Alice in Wonderland. Alice is taken from, at her time, modern day England, and put into this wonderland of all this weird stuff happening around her. Cheshire cats and bunny rabbits with big clocks, all these things. So that's a fish out of water story. You take a character from his or her comfort zone and put them into something completely different, right? A lot of comedies do this, right? So for example, I'm trying to think of a famous movie, but like any sports movie where you have somebody who's not played that sport before and they have to come in and like, you know, figure out what to do. There's a classic movie where it was a hockey player who had to become an ice skater, figure skater, like a male-female partner ice skating couple. And so the hockey player had no idea, of course, what ice skating was all about, but then came into that world and of course was funny as he tries to figure out how to navigate the world of figure skating coming from a world of hockey where everybody kind of runs into each other, right? So that would be a good example of a fish out of water story. A 2-person relationship scene is a scene in which 2 people are building a relationship. And what's interesting about a 2-person relationship scene is it's very much about the relationship. So in addition to making people laugh, there's also this kind of heartfelt emotional component to it as well. So we don't really see a lot of 2-person relationship scenes in OM because there are 7 people on a team, but it's possible, right? And it's a good reminder to keep in your mind that not everything has to be funny, right? There can be nice emotional components to your solution as well, although I tend to see that most OM solutions have a funny slant to them. When it comes to goof scenes and talent scenes, in the comedy world, goof scene is just doing something ridiculous, right? So many years ago at Second City, a former cast member who then was on Saturday Night Live briefly, walked out on stage and just ate a Chipotle burrito while like a romantic 80s love ballad played. airplane. Completely silly. All he did was eat a burrito, like ate the whole Chipotle burrito on stage in like 2 minutes. Super goofy. We laugh at goofy things, right? It's just ridiculous, right? So when you do your scenes, you can think like maybe there's an opportunity just to be goofy to make people laugh. Related to this is a talent scene. You might have a talent, right? Maybe you're a musician, maybe you sing, maybe you juggle or like balance the plates on your hands or whatever. So just be thinking, how can I leverage that talent in the context of my long-term solution? Because that's kind of fun to watch. Humans like watching these things, right? Another type of scene is what's called entrances and exits. Entrances and exits is exactly what it sounds like. There's comedy that comes in basically from people entering and exiting the scene. So a lot of times it could be something like, let's say somebody's about to propose marriage to someone else, and then as he or she's about to do that, then I don't know, the wait staff from the restaurant comes in and interrupts them every single time they're about to ask the question, will you marry me, right? So as an audience member, we're watching this happening and we think, oh, that's so funny because they're trying to just get this simple question out and they can't do it because every time they do, somebody from the restaurant comes out to ask if they want their drink refilled or if they want dessert, whatever the case may be. My favorite example of an entrance and exit scene is from the Disney movie, The Emperor's New Groove. I have it pictured up here in the top right-hand corner. There is a scene where they're in a restaurant and they keep coming in and out of a room. I won't say any more than that. You should watch it online if you want. But the comedy comes from the characters entering and exiting at very pivotal times in the scene, which creates this tension, which creates comedy, right? So entrances and exits, again, comedy is made by having people enter and exit a scene at just the right time, which produces pretty funny results. You also have what's called a town hall scene, which is a group scene. Group scenes, of course, involve more than just two characters. So town hall scenes is where, like in Parks and Recreation, the TV show, they literally had town halls. You have somebody who is a government representative, or depending on the context, it could be a teacher's meeting, it could be anything, but you have people in an audience that ask questions or make comments. That's the town hall format. It's used a lot in comedy writing. It's certainly something you could look into, but if you ever need an example, a lot of Parks and Recreation relied on this notion of a town hall to create comedy in the moment. And it allows you to showcase a lot of different characters in the audience, right? So the people, whoever those townspeople are, whoever those other teachers are, the faculty meeting, you can create really funny, interesting characters when you do a town hall type of scene. I think the important thing to point out about a town hall scene and a group scene is when you have so many people on stage, it's very important that each person has his or her own unique character. If you have 7 people on stage and 6 people all act the same way with the same mannerisms, the same look, everything, you don't really have much entertaining to watch, right? Because it's 6 people doing the same thing and 1 person doing something different. If instead you have 7 people on stage and each one represents a different emotion, inside out, basically you get the idea that it's more entertaining, it's more compelling because each character, each person has his or her own character that stands out. All right, moving on to center and eccentric. So another really common type of scene or comedy approach is the use of what's called a center and his or her eccentrics. So a center is a person who's just kind of like grounded, very much like you and me, right? Normal, but they represent kind of the audience in the scene, right? So like if I'm a center in a center and eccentric scene, when the audience is watching me on stage, it's like I'm kind of the voice of reason in the scene and I share that with the audience, right? The eccentrics are all the other people around me who are, as it sounds, pretty crazy, right? So the best example of this would be something like The Office, the TV show. So in the American version, you have Jim and Pam, who are the centers. They are people like you and me. They're pretty much normal, right? They have their own quirks, but they're pretty normal. And then think about everybody else in the office, including Michael Scott, the boss. They are all super eccentric, right? Angela has her cats and she's worried about everything all the time. Dwight is a conspiracy theorist and he's always thinking he's better than he actually is. Who else? Phyllis, that crew, like they all have their own little weird quirks. They're all a little off, right? And the people that are the normal ones are Jim and Pam. So they're the center and the eccentrics are everybody else, right? Another classic example of this is the television show 30 Rock. So Tina Fey plays a character named Liz Lemon, who's quirky in her own way, but she's the one who has to keep that show together. And everybody else, the other cast members, the writers, her boss, Jack Donaghy, all these other folks are super eccentric, right? Like they are a character taken to the extreme, and she's the one that has to sort of corral them all and keep them all focused on putting a show together, right? So that's the idea of center, the normal, the person who's like you and me, like the audience, and the eccentrics, all the people around them that are just like off the wall. And then lastly here, another type of scene is a monologue, exactly what it sounds like. It's when one person comes out and presents a story alone, like on their own. Again, you don't see that a lot in OM just because it's such a team-driven program, but at the same time, it's another type of scene that I wanted to make you aware of. Okay, cool. So in addition to scene types, there's also types of jokes. So let's talk about our joke toolkit for a second. And again, there are many other ways to be funny, but when we talk about how to write jokes, when I teach comedy classes, these are the kinds of things that I like to teach to students. So a lot of times comedy comes from having conflict, right? So what do I mean by that? I mean, not necessarily like I'm fighting with someone else, but I have a goal, I have an objective that I'm trying to pursue. I have a want, I have a thing that I really want to get done. And then for whatever reason, the world is working against me, other people are working against me, or I'm working against myself. I'm doing things that are preventing me from getting my goal. And when we watch this, when we watch somebody on stage who clearly has a goal and the world is working against him or her, or an enemy is working against him or her, then that's what is funny, because we know, we can relate to that, right? We're like, oh, I know what it's like to need to get that goal accomplished and have everything in the world like falling apart around you to prevent you from doing it. So when I say conflict, there are these three types, right? There's the self versus the world. Like I have a goal, but the world is like out to get me and I can't get it done. Self versus the other. So I have a goal, but other people are preventing me from doing that in some way, or like holding what I need away from me. And then there's also the self versus the self. Like I'm my own worst enemy kind of thing, right? A good self versus self would be the old I Love Lucy episodes, or some of the vaudevillian stuff with like the Harpo Marx and other people like this, where you would see them doing things and then like they were silly, right? So like the time Lucy and Ethel were trying to put was wallpaper on the wall, but they didn't know what they were doing. They were kind of sloppy and they were messy. So rather than like pay somebody to do it, they tried to do it on their own, and they were super unsuccessful. They like made it so it was vertical. At one point, I think Lucy or Ethel got like wallpapered to the wall, so it like went over them. So that's kind of a self versus self. Like we are our own worst enemies. We're like creating these problems for ourselves. A self versus other, think of like Moana, right? So you have Maui and Moana, they're trying to get things done, but they're kind of getting in each other's way all the time. Or the Three Stooges, classic example, like Moe, Larry, Curly, they would be trying to do something, but one of the other two Stooges would always kind of get in the way. And then the self versus the world is a much broader version of that, right? The world's just out to get you and you can't quite get to the goal that you're trying to accomplish, right? Every turn you take, the wind is working against you, the stars are malaligned. So that's the idea of conflict. And when you watch some comedy shows, movies, you'll see a lot of this sort of theme of conflict in terms of creating comedy. So moving on, there's also what's called the rule of three. You've probably heard about this before, right? We tend to say things come in threes, but so do jokes, right? So a lot of times there's the setup, and a payoff. So there's three things. One is a setup, two is a setup, three is the joke. So you can do this with anything. So say, for example, you were like, oh, you know, I'm so excited for fall because I can't wait to eat apple pie, have some apple cider, and eat an Apple computer. And you're like, wait, what? Like, so obviously apple pie, apple cider, we're setting up the joke to get to an Apple computer because it turns out you can't eat an Apple computer and you shouldn't, or maybe just don't do it in fall. But the idea is we're expecting apple, so we have apple pie, we have apple cider, so we're expecting some sort of like apple strudel or apple sauce, whatever the case may be. So when we say Apple computer, that we're going to eat an Apple computer, we're like, wait a minute, and our brain thinks, that's funny, right? So that's the rule of three, setting up 1, 2, and then punching the joke with 3. Expectation and defeat, that's sort of the reason why the rule of three works, because we have an expectation of where we're going, and then we kind of like knock that down and like suddenly it's gone. So anytime we have any sort of expectation, right? So say, for example, there's a scene where there's a fire, right? There's a fire in a kitchen, and we expect, what do we expect? Well, we expect that the fire alarm will go off and that the firemen will come in and actually put the fire out, right? So that's the expectation in that. But what if the firemen show up and instead of putting out the fire, they actually take some skewers and marshmallows and create s'mores in the fire instead of putting it out? That would be kind of funny, right? And that's where expectations are set up, but then they're defeated by what actually winds up happening. So the next point there on no cliches, a lot of times when we're writing scenes, we tend to rely on cliches because it's easy. It's kind of like lazy writing. But if we say somebody's a slob, okay, we get it, that's fine. But if we can be more specific, right? So instead of saying somebody's a slob, instead we say, clearly you didn't go to Eton and study all the wonderful fine etiquette of what's expected of Royal England. Great, it was a mouthful, but it's a little bit more specific than just calling somebody a slob, right? So the more specific you can be in your writing, the more specific you can be in your jokes, the more likely the audience is to appreciate it and find it funny. And again, when we think about creativity in OM, we're talking about original and effective. So we still call the person a slob, but we did so in a much more original way, which then enhances creativity. Running gags and callbacks, that's what happens when you do something that's funny or like silly at the beginning of the scene, and then you continue referring to it or returning to it throughout the scene, right? So maybe there's, I don't know, some sort of cat pun that you make at the very beginning of a scene. If you come back to a cat pun in the middle of the scene and a cat pun at the very end of your scene, that's the idea of a running gag or a callback, right? You're bringing back the joke and playing it again. For whatever reason, audiences really like that repetition. They find it really funny. So that's another way to kind of evoke comedy in a structured form. Wordplay, as I just said, you could use cat puns, you can use alliteration, right? Anything that you can do to use words in a clever, funny way. I put a joke here. So what's the best thing about Switzerland? Well, the answer is, I don't know, but the flag is a big plus, which if you're familiar with the Swiss flag, it's a big plus on a red background. So again, that's kind of playing around with the words, because a big plus means it's a good thing, but also it literally is a plus sign, right? So we're having some wordplay, and audiences like that. It's related to the last point here, which is recognizing the humor in everyday life, which I call the laugh of recognition. When we point out sort of the things that happen in the day-to-day, right? So, oh gosh, let's see. When you say, for example, you get up and you put your feet on the cold floor if you have a wooden floor, or say you go into the bathroom in the morning from your bedroom and you're putting your feet on tile, that cold feeling you get. If you write a skit that talks about the cold feeling of putting your feet on the cold floor after you get up in the morning and how people hate it, everyone can relate to that, right? Same thing, say you're taking a shower, you get out of the shower and it's nice and warm in the shower, but you take a step out and it's freezing cold. That freezing cold feeling is something we all can relate to. We don't talk about it often, but we all know what it is, right? So those moments you can put into your scenes or into your skits that evoke memories from everyday life that we can all relate to tends to cause this laugh of recognition. Something feels familiar to us and we understand what you're saying and we're like, ha, I know exactly what you're talking about, right? So that's what we call the laugh of recognition. All right, cool. So again, all of these are just tools. You don't have to use any of these things as you're working on your solution. You get to decide what to do for your solution, but how to write a skit, types of jokes, all these are tools that you should put in your toolkit, that you can use not just to solve your OM problem, but also in life. All right, so when it comes to formatting your scenes as you're typing it, you're free to type it however you want, but I wanted to introduce you to one tool, the proper formatting for a scene. This is true for screenwriting, it's true for comedy skits like the ones you're writing. So I put here, there's a universal way to format a script with some changes based on who you're talking to. It's not required, as I said, but it's just good to know for your own skills. You'll notice right at the top here, there's the title of the scene. So this scene is called Donut Yell at Me. It's by Conrad, who was one of my former students. Here's the date that Conrad wrote this, and it's version 1, right? Because in OM, in writing, we will have more than one version, right? So this is the first version of Conrad's scene. Something to point out here, the cast is listed here. So Joe and Becky are the two characters, and a little bit about who they are. So Joe is clearly a worker at Conrad's Donut Shop, and Becky is a customer at Conrad's Donut Shop. And then in these parentheses, we notice we've included stage direction. So not just what people are saying, but what they're doing. So at the very beginning of the scene, Becky walks in. You'll notice that these are tabbed over 5 tabs. This is not actually centered. It's tabbed over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's just a formatting issue. If you center it, no one's going to complain about it. But that's the character name in all caps. And this is what Joe says. He would say, hello and welcome to Conrad's Donut Shop. What can I get for you today? And then Becky says, hi, can I please get a rainbow sprinkle donut? And that's how it proceeds on and on and on. So you'll notice after, let's see, so Joe responds, I'm sorry, but we're out of rainbow sprinkle donuts. Here we have another stage direction. So Becky is very angry. So she tips over a coffee cup. Oh no, who knows what happens next, right? But that's the idea. The dialogue is here under the name. And then in parentheses, you have the scene direction or stage direction for what those characters should be doing. Just in terms of technical details, the typeface, the font here is Courier New. That's very common in script writing. Stage direction in parentheses, as I said. You should note that each page of a scene, when formatted like this, will roughly correspond to 1 minute in real world time, which is why formatting is super helpful. Formatting it this way is super helpful because it gives you an idea. If you're writing an 8-minute skit and suddenly you're on page 10 and you formatted it like this, chances are you have too much and you're gonna have to cut it back, right? If you were writing like this and you write 3 pages and you're like, wait a minute, this is not gonna be 8 minutes, that's probably true, right? So just know that when you format it like this, each one page usually corresponds to roughly 1 minute of real world time. You're also going to use page numbers for references in your header or your footer, whatever you prefer. And now you're all set. Once you do OM, you can go write some movies for Hollywood. And I would love it. And if you write a blockbuster, invite me to the Oscar Awards because I'd love to come with you and as the person who taught you how to do proper formatting. So here's just a close-up of what we were just talking about so you could see it up close. All right, now, last thing here, let's talk about your skit through the lens of point allocation in OM. You have 8 minutes to perform your skit. That's it, right? No more than 8 minutes, just 8 minutes. And you probably want to use the full 8 minutes, right? Sometimes there are teams that come in and present their solution in like 3 or 4 minutes, and you're like, maybe you might want to have spent more time explaining your solution to the judges. You have 8 minutes, right? So use as much of those 8 minutes as you possibly can that you need. So the question you want to ask yourself is, does the skit that you wrote clearly convey all the required elements of your problem? So if we go back and look at your specific long-term solution, under section B, where it says limitations, does our skit address all of those limitations exactly how the problem says you have to do it? If it does, you've done a great job. And if not, you need to go back and see if you can tweak it so that it does. Is it clear? Is it easy to follow and understand? Is it effective, right? So when you're writing your skit, you have to remember that yes, it's important that you like your skit. That is true. But remember, you are presenting the skit in front of judges and in front of an audience, right? So what you find funny is great. Hopefully your audience and your judges also find that funny because that's whom will be scoring you, right? So you want to make sure that your skit is clear, that the judges, if they're seeing it for the first time, can understand what it is you're saying, what's happening in the skit. It's not super confusing. You only have 8 minutes to explain everything. So just make sure that there's clarity with respect to your skit and how it addresses the long-term problem. Sometimes the actual long-term problems map really well onto typical scene structure. So what do I mean by that? Well, maybe there's a problem, maybe it's a vehicle problem that says your problem is to build a vehicle that completes 3 tasks, undergoes some sort of transformation, and there's a grand finale. Well, if we think about this in the context of 5-point scene structure, great. So there's a vehicle premise, right? We start with this, whatever it is, completes 3 tasks. So when I think about step 3, heightening, there's beat 1, beat 2, beat 3. Those are my 3 tasks. There's a transformation. So there's a second turning point. The vehicle changes in some way. And there's a grand finale, or the out, how things end, right? So sometimes long-term problems map perfectly onto traditional sketch writing structure. Sometimes they don't, right? But that's okay because you can actually then still use 5-point scene structure to impose some sort of structure on your long-term problem, right? So if you know you have to do all these things as specified in your specific long-term problem, one way to sort of organize those thoughts is to use something like 5-point scene structure or another structured approach to skit writing to help organize all those ideas and all those elements you have to include as specified by your long-term problem. So that is skit writing. It's one tool that you now have as you're addressing and solving your long-term problem. Progress report, do you understand? You only have 8 minutes to present your solution. That's it. It's going to go by very quickly. You want to make sure you use that time wisely. Do you, number 2, know what 5-point scene structure is, right? So we start with the premise, and then the next step, step 2, is first turning point. Step 3 is heightening. Step 4 is second turning point. And step 5 is the out. And you understand how all these relate to one another and how they're used all the time in Disney movies, in comedies, in sitcoms, things like this. You'll see it everywhere. I promise you, now that you know it, you'll see it all the time. And then finally, do you, number 3, know common types of comedy scenes and tools that you can use for your jokes? I talked about a lot of them. There are a lot more than the ones I talked about. But again, the goal here is to introduce you to how to write skits, how to think about jokes, how to think about comedy, how to think about types of comedy scenes. So then that way, when you're developing your own solution to your long-term problem, now you can open up this toolkit of skit writing and jokes and comedy, and then say, how can I use these tools to solve my specific long-term problem, right? I can't do it for you. I can present you all these tools that we've talked about, but it's up to you to figure out how to actually solve your specific long-term problem, how to write your own skit, how to create your own characters, how to write your own jokes. That is all on you. But now, after this lesson, you are more than equipped with the tools to make that happen. So let's go back to our big checklist. Did we talk about how to write a skit? We sure did. It looks like next lesson, we're going to talk about actually building your solution, which includes costumes, backdrops, props, and everything else. So I will see you next time.